A Science of Change, podcasting by Gilmore Crosby, social scientist, author, and organization development professional since 1984. Hi, good to be with you again. This episode is another teaching episode, and I am drawing from my book, Diversity Without Dogma, which the primary reason this book is important is because it takes Kurt Lewin's social science, which was often applied by Lewin as he devised it and as he used it to combating prejudice, what he called minority relations, especially racism, the racism he experienced as a Jewish person, and the racism that he walked into when he fled the Nazis and is relocated to the United States, especially the racism against African Americans in the U.S., was what caught his attention. He also consistently fought sexism, and the way that he fought it was by learning how to help people change their beliefs and their values through education processes, and also through how he taught. He believed, like Dewey, that the way we teach is as important as what we are teaching. And so he always engaged female students in dialogue. He engaged students in dialogue. That was unheard of in Berlin, at the University of Berlin. The classes Lewin had been in, speaking was strictly verboten for the students. And if you were lucky, you might have contact with professors outside of class, in their office, outside of class hours. He did have relationships like that with professors, but only through his own unique persistence, charm, and intelligence, persuading them. But with his own students, when he became a professor at the University of Berlin, he would have back and forth throughout his classes, and then they would continue into the night in coffee shops with as many women involved as there were men. Much of the documentation of his students and their dialogue back then involved the female students, many of whom went on to earn doctorates and also pursue the social sciences. So Lewin was consistent in his behavior. As Gandhi says, be the change you want to see in the world. He certainly was that. And his application helps one understand racism with a clearer knowledge of the dynamics, the social dynamics that are occurring, with less blame of individuals and more clarity about how to change conditions than much of the DEI literature and education processes, at least that I have been able to find, and I've been searching. So I did a pretty diligent search, including attending workshops, before I wrote this book. If you are more interested in Lewin's social science by itself, my first book about Lewin, Planned Change, is an excellent source, because his social science is as applicable to leadership, certainly, change in organizations. That is, if you're trying to get anything done, how best to create change that actually gets implemented and sustained. And we're going to go into that some here, because that's obviously also important if you're combating something like racism. So here we go. Lewinian Social Science, Chapter 2. I'll read some, and I'll mostly just talk to you about the essence of this chapter, which is, in many ways, the essence of this book. So it begins with a graphic that shows social science concepts relevant to prejudice and inequality, and then gives you a background about Lewin in creating his social science as he experienced being Jewish in Germany during the 30s, the 20s, the 30s, as the Nazis rose to power. And so he was very concerned with what he called minority relations, which means when there's inequality. Now, the group that has less power might be the majority, as the Jewish people were in the Holy Land during the time of Jesus. It was occupied by the Romans, and Jews, unless they had some sort of exceptional role, like King Herod, Jews had no rights. A Roman could kill a Jew, and there was no legal redress for the family, for instance, of the lost soul. So that was the condition in many societies where there have been majorities who are powerless, essentially powerless. And so in that case, that's minority relations. And so Lewin says some things about being powerless, which I just find very helpful. For one, he drew graphics. So if you can imagine an oval, and he used topography to help illustrate social conditions. If you can imagine an oval, and there's a circle inside the oval itself, most of the space represents the majority experience. The majority can go where they please. Now, in the United States, historically, that has been white males, and white males of the upper class. If you go to a country club, you didn't find white males that were poor. You found white males that had money. So white males have had access to most space in this culture, and poor white males less so, women less so, even if they were white. And then, of course, the only blacks you would find in a country club during most of the history of the United States were servants. And if you go far enough back, they were slaves. So the restriction of movement, of opportunity, who can get an education, who can rise up in organizations. The glass ceiling is an illustration of this same thing. And also an illustration where 50% of the population is in a minority relations experience. That is, women not being able to rise higher in organizations than a certain level. So there's restrictions on what you can do and what you can't do. I mean, a great example of that was the United States after World War II, when women had been the mechanics and the operators in all the military industrial plants. And as soon as the war was over, they were sent home. Didn't matter what their new experience, what their skills were, what the performance of the factory was. They were stripped of their jobs, and in the interest of giving the returning GIs the same jobs, and those were the returning white GIs that got those jobs. So minority experience is real boundaries between what you can do and what you can't do, where you can go and where you can't go. And so if you're in the minority, you are, as Lewin put it, marginal. You're on the margin. You are, if, for instance, blacks in this country who were pale-skinned have passed, as have Jewish people, by changing their names. That is, they have pretended to be part of the majority at the expense of staying connected to their own families, their own communities, at enormous expense to their own psychological well-being. And many, of course, don't have that capacity to pass as the opposite, as the people in power. It's like the Sneetches in Dr. Seuss. The star-bellied Sneetches were the upper class, and the Sneetches without stars were the lower class. And until McMonkey McBean came along and sold stars to the lower classes, there was no ability to pass as the upper class. So there was separation. And the separation isn't necessarily physical. You might live in the same home, but be separated in terms of who has power. So the people in the minority wish they had the prosperity of the people in the majority. And yet they also, of course, resent, or likely at least to resent the people in the majority and wish them ill, perhaps, understandably so. And they also are likely to resent being in the minority. So they are likely to have very ambivalent and perhaps worse feelings about their own people, their own group that they are attached to. And so they may reject those attachments. Of course, so for a long time, the image in our culture of beauty was Caucasian women. And so for a long time, African women, and still today, buy hair which is straight and long, like the Caucasian image of beauty, instead of just wearing their own hair. And when they do wear their own hair, the men and the women, as in Texas recently, get punished for wearing a hairstyle that's different than the majority norm. So there's all kinds of ways that the minority experience is damaging and restrictive, and it causes confusion. Am I having the experience I'm having with this person from the majority group because of my skin color or my gender or my ethnicity? Or am I having a difficult experience because of my own behavior, my own qualifications? Do I need to work on myself? Or is this more of what you would call systemic or institutional? And so that confusion is enough to drive people a little crazy, including the majority people. Is my own behavior somehow causing the tension between me and another? Or are they upset with me simply because I'm a male and I'm pale-skinned, categorized as white? And so even in the work of talking about DEI, I get reactions because of my appearance, the stuff I was born into biologically, over which I have no control. And, because the majority has ruled so long, I also get passage because of my appearance. When I work in cultures where I'm the only light-skinned person, people want to know what I think, partially because they're used to light-skinned people having the expertise because of the access they've had to wealth and to knowledge. And so it goes both ways. There's all kinds of ways that this influences relationships. The key word, though, with Lewin is the ambiguity. If you always think that what's happening in front of you is because of racism or sexism, you're of course wrong. It's not always that. And sometimes it is one's own behavior. if you deny that much of the inequality and restriction and reactions is based on racism and sexism in this culture, then you're also wrong. Because much of it is based on prejudice about gender, about race, etc. So it's confusing, and it's easy to get it wrong in the moment. And so it's wise to be humble about it, and yet to work tirelessly to create more equality. The only thing that's going to decrease the ambiguity and the confusion and the real restrictions and inequality is equality. So the closer we get to equality, the more we can have adult-to-adult relationships instead of relationships that are poisoned by power imbalance. So for heaven's sake, help move society towards equality. That's a Lewinian action approach. Okay, so it's unclearness. So Lewin here was talking about the same thing. I use lots of quotes from Lewin in my work. He talks about the pressure in minority groups kept together because of their own needs, but also because of outside pressure. And anyway, I highly recommend you read this because I can't do justice to Lewin. But moving beyond the ambiguity, then, all behavior is a function of personality and the environment. And so how I interact with you is partially influenced by this environment of minority relations, power imbalance that we live in. And one of my goals in life is to figure out how to see people as they are, regardless of whether they're white, black, red, no one's red, a lighter shade of brown, you could say. Really, probably all human beings are on a spectrum from darker to lighter of the same shades. And gender and other differences. Can I just tune into the person I'm with and not have those differences confuse me or lead me to biases about what they're about or about what the interaction is about? That's a skill that really, that's one reason I love T group learning, which is another thing Lewin invented. In a T group, you pay attention to your immediate reactions to the people that you're with, and you explore them together, even if it's uncomfortable at times. But you explore your feelings, your emotions from moment to moment, what you believe they mean when they're speaking, whether that's really what they meant, how to be understood the way you want to be understood, along with how's the group influencing my own behavior. Do I become afraid to say certain things in this group because of the reaction that I've gotten at some point, or that just simply that I fear I will get? If I notice that the men are talking more than the women, am I going to talk about that because it's a group dynamic, or am I going to avoid it because I'm afraid it'll upset the men or the women? Who knows what kind of reaction you'll get if you actually talk about what's happening. But if you don't talk about what's happening, then you're a prisoner to it. And that's true in any group you're in. The social construction of reality, we are influenced heavily. So back to B equals a function of personality and the environment. The environment has a huge influence, I think, more than nature. So nurture over nature. If you were born in 500 BC in Greece, you would speak Greek, in the local dialect. And so you certainly wouldn't speak whatever language you speak today. And you would believe in the worldview of the people that raised you. Their beliefs about the origin of the world and the nature of spirituality and the world order. And the Greeks generally believed that they were better than the people around them. So the us and them-ness has gone back a long ways, as far back as writing, and even further back, no doubt, where we contrast ourselves with other groups and we likely believe our own group is better. And that, of course, contributes to the ongoing us and them that we see. You can see it right now in the Middle East pretty boldly. Us and them. And so as long as we are unable to see ourselves in them, we will stay separate. And separateness begets separateness. So the social construction of reality, it's a widely understood sociological construct. It's not debatable from a scientific point of view. People all over the world have their own way of looking at things. Gender roles, skin color. Skin color has become a uniquely social construct in the United States, beginning all the way back to the Virginia colony, which I document carefully in this book, by the way. I have the original proclamation where the word white was used and where the legal rights of whites to shoot blacks, that's not what they were called at the time, Negroes, escaped slaves, etc. The legal right to shoot them was granted to the entire white population, and that was because the whites, poor whites, servants, and the black slaves had risen together successfully over and over again, successfully enough to scare the heck out of the ruling classes in Virginia, the Virginia colony. And so the British brought in troops, quelled the rebellion, and then set up a divide and conquer strategy, which put the poor whites in charge of the black population. And that has stuck in this culture in a unique way. The idea that there's black and white is a social construction. At the time, and since then, various ethnic groups that are lighter skinned, especially from Eastern Europe, have been considered as dirt by the ruling class and not considered white, and only more recently became integrated into whiteness. So that's true of the certainly the Italians. It's true of the Irish. They were originally brought over as servants to the Virginia colony and beaten and raped and whipped. There was a model for what became the way that the ruling classes controlled the African population in the United States. So the idea that there's white and black is a social construction. It is not a scientific construction. It is a class warfare construction, dividing and conquering one group over the other so that the people who have really held power in the country can continue to do so, versus having the people who have less power unite and rebel. That's really how it started. Read my book, or just look it up. Google Bacon's Rebellion, and much of that information is available to you. Now, whether or not you believe that society is socially constructed, you may believe that if you were born 500 BC, you would still think the things you think today. That'd be a tough thing to hold on to from a scientific perspective. But, people are capable of holding on to incredibly unsubstantiated beliefs. Anyway, I trust that most of you get the basic idea about the social construction of reality. So, you see, that's important because it means that we can change beliefs and values even if you start to realize that you look down on a group and you don't want to continue to do so. You can change that. You can change how you look at people. If you hold a prejudice like all women are bad drivers, for instance, the statistics don't hold that up. As a matter of fact, if you think that you are a better driver than everybody else, welcome to the club, because almost everybody thinks that. maybe everybody. And it's obviously not a factual belief. And it's a good example of a belief that if you had evidence and if you were working with peers to really think it through, it'd be hard to hold on to, because how can you be a better driver than your peers that you're talking to who also think they're better drivers than you? Somebody's got to be wrong. And all it takes is a drive down the freeway to realize that there's a lot of crappy drivers out there. But the important thing is self-awareness. Really, what's my behavior, and how is it that I am forming false conclusions at times about my own abilities, and perhaps about the abilities of the group that I identify with. So that's what creates a lot of this nonsense about race and ethnicity, and leads to a lot of the trouble in the world, unfortunately. We're easily led down the path of us versus them. Democratic principles. Well, obviously, if you have a culture where everyone is able to have access to resources, to a reasonable access to things like education, and where people are able to influence their government, and people are able to influence their work. I mean, that's one of the things I work on in workplaces. If you allow the people doing the physical labor to influence things like whether or not they get the parts they need or the supplies so they can do the physical labor, you will have more productivity and higher morale, because people want to influence. They don't want to simply be controlled, especially if they're being controlled and problems that are obvious to them aren't being solved. So the whole web of Lewinian social science is based on democratic principles. He proved in his own research over and over again that when people are able to influence, they are more engaged. They're more likely to implement solutions that they helped to generate, or at least have a say in, at least discuss. They are more likely to sustain those solutions effectively if they were able to influence them. All of this is the reason why democratic societies have often been better at fighting than authoritarian societies, because the soldiers have more of a stake in a democratic society than they do in a totalitarian state. And so that may be why the Greeks were able to defeat the Persian Empire, where the soldiers were used as fodder and had no say and no influence, whereas the Greeks at that time often, not always, had so much influence that they could even fire their generals. So they would vote after a battle on whether or not to keep the same person in charge or to have a new person in charge. In some of their history, not all of it. Alexander the Great, for instance, was more totalitarian than he was democratic in his rule, and he was a pretty successful totalitarian, although the whole thing fell apart, right, eventually. That tends to happen with authoritarian rule. So Lewin was intensely interested in authority and democracy and authoritarianism because of his experience in Germany growing up. But it turned out that it also was the foundation for sound social science and sound leadership. That you figure out how to give as much freedom as possible, and yet you're also providing structure. If you're not providing structure, there is no freedom without structure. So you can't play a game like, let's say, softball, with a bunch of friends if you don't follow rules. And the same is true of getting work done. And so, unfortunately, a lot of managers in workplaces, and this is true, unfortunately, of the left in some of the social movement work, people are afraid to let people make decisions, let anyone be in charge. And so it's important to create clear authority relationships and to give people the ability to act and make decisions at work and outside of work if you want things to get done. You have to support people just like you would support a lifeguard if they said clear the pool. You don't need to have a vote from everyone in the pool at that point. That would obviously be counterproductive. So democratic principles don't mean always that there's consensus or that there is a vote. It means that you have effective influence structures, and that the democratic leader is able to act. You let the people that you are supporting in leadership positions act. You help them. Okay, so field theory. So every system is being held in place. And so Lewin called that homeostasis, borrowing from the physical sciences. There's a reason why things are the way they are, and a reason why things are stuck. And if you want to unstick things, certainly one of the ways to do it is to invite the opposition in to dialogue, some kind of structured dialogue. It's much easier to stay in opposition and to stay apart if you aren't actually talking to each other. And if you vilify the opposition, you are doing the same thing they are doing. So you have to break the homeostasis, unfreeze it is what Lewin called it. And the way we do that in workplaces is to have everybody in the system, or at least a representation in the room, identifying what's in the way and coming up with solutions. And you can do the same thing in social action. Get everyone in a community, a representation in the room. Let's say it's gun violence. Get the gun owners in the room. Get the gun dealers in the room. Get the police in the room. Get the grandmothers living on the block in the room. Get the young kids that have guns in the room. Get citizens who don't have guns in the room. Get the government in the room. And organize a structured dialogue about what's in the way of creating less gun violence, and and come up with solutions. So you've got to break the homeostasis, certainly of us and them. You have to break that homeostasis. And again, there's more information in either of these Lewinian books about how to do that. Group dynamics, I've already said enough about this, I think. I will say that Lewin did a whole bunch of studies. He was unique in this. He would have one group be told what to do, and then he would have the same person come to another group. And by told what to do, it could even be simply a lecture. So passive learning. If somebody just lectures and there's no dialogue, the odds of people really thinking for themselves and learning are low. If you don't have time where students are talking to each other, they're talking to the person that's teaching, there's give and take, then they may learn enough to pass a test, but the odds that they're really learning to think and they are really even challenging their own thinking is low. So that's Lewin about education and social change. If you have a DEI class where people are just lectured at and told that if they are pale-skinned, they're part of the institutional racism automatically, and that they are suspiciously, at least, they're suspected of being biased against darker skinned people automatically. And there's no dialogue except if someone says, I don't think I'm racist, you tell them that that's proof they are. And this is how some of the workshops are. Just read White Fragility. It's a New York Times bestseller. And it clearly states all white people are racist in more than one place. And so that kind of us and them approach is divisive. And of course, is unlikely to do anything but humiliate people. Now, some people take that humiliation and work on themselves and learn from it. And they think that's the only way, apparently, because it's very popular. And people get mad at me for questioning it. But I question it because I don't believe that, as Lewin states very clearly, and he did research on this where he had different types of learning occur, that if people are just lectured to, and there's no real dialogue, and there's no real humility on the part of the person doing the lecturing, where they are not just humble and saying, yes, I admit that I'm also racist. Humble for their own means is how some of this stuff gets done. But it's not real humility where they could be at least saying, you know what, maybe I am part of the reason you're feeling defensive. Maybe my own behavior is part of this puzzle. That's the humility that I think is missing from a lot of the DEI work. And so please stop that. Figure out ways to invite people in from all backgrounds. We need help in this cause. And it's not going to come from having some people who are okay with being humiliated participate and others reject it. And right now, DEI is getting rejected by many people. And I don't think it's a big surprise. It's, of course, you push people, they push back. That's Lewinian. So how do you invite people in and help them with dignity explore what's happening within them and between them? And so you don't do that just through lecture. You don't do that through just forcing solutions. That's the essence of Lewinian group dynamics. You do that by giving people a chance to talk privately in pairs, talk as a group without being without condemnation, and the peers will start to influence each other if what you're saying makes sense to them. And so there's a lot more about that in here too. Prejudice is a false hypothesis. I've already said that. There's just no scientific basis that any group is better than any other group. There's no DNA that shows that. There's no DNA that shows that we're different races. We are the same. We just have different shades of skin tone because our ancestors lived where there was more sun or less sun. And our physical characteristics reproduced over time. So we look a little bit different from different regions of the world. There's no superiority in that. So get over it. And there's certainly no superiority in gender differences. None of that's scientific. It's all social. And it's a social disease. Okay, and so next thing is education here. Consistent with his democratic values, anyone can be in the role of social scientist. That's the goal of my work, is that you learn how to set up action research where you are engaging people to improve productivity, where you are engaging the community to change social conditions. A critical variable then is how the social scientist, amateur or professional, boss or peer, relates to the people in the intervention. In Lewin's mind, they must guide the process, but also engage as human peers. Holding oneself above or separate from the group could actually become a restraining force when conducting change. To influence a group, the social scientist must actually, even if only temporarily, become a peer with the group. Quote, here's Lewin. The normal gap between teacher and student, doctor and patient, can be a real obstacle to acceptance of the advocated conduct. In other words, in spite of whatever status differences there might be between them, the teacher and the student have to feel as members of one group in matters involving their sense of values. The chances for re-education, as Lewin called it, and this was before the Chinese re-education camps, this has nothing to do with that. This re-education is about people thinking for themselves and changing how they look at the world. The chances for re-education seem to increase whenever a strong we feeling is created. That is Lewin. Bring people together, do it with humility, use structure so it's not just a free-for-all, and talk about difficult issues. That's Lewinian approaches to minority relations. And let people say what they really think. If you censor people, you're not creating we feeling. You're creating you are smarter than they feeling. And they're going to walk out the door resenting you. Quote, an individual will believe facts he or she has discovered in the same way that he or she believes in themselves or in their group. End quote. So if the group changes how they look at things, the individual is more likely to change how they look at things. We are all part of groups, and in order to fit in, we can't be too different. And so if we go and get individual training and then go back to our group, the odds are we're going to erode even any kind of gains we made and become more like the group again. It's a heavy pressure. It's subtle, but it's there. And so to change the individual, Lewin quite clearly demonstrated it's more likely to stick if the group changes. As he put it, quote, we are all slowly coming to realize that all education is group work, end quote. And then he goes on to make connections between how we teach. I mentioned this before. If we teach in such a way that the children are encouraged to think for themselves with structure, then they will likely grow up to be effective participants in democracy. But if we just teach at home and in school in such a way that the children are told that the adults already have the answers, and their job is to memorize the approved answers that the adults hold, then we will raise a bunch of citizens who are prone to authoritarianism. And we have been doing that for quite some time. And so we may be getting what we have brought upon ourselves. And that upsets me because I prefer democracy over authoritarianism. And certainly in race relations, a democracy has much more chance of creating real equality than authoritarianism, even though we have failed to get there so far, in my humble opinion. Now, there's a whole section in here about the playing field, and I already did make a podcast about history. So if you're surprised to hear that inequality exists in the United States, then I suggest that you read or listen to the material where the evidence shows quite clearly that there's been inequality since the beginning of the European arrival. And, some would just call it colonization. Of course, it was colonization at first. That's why they were called colonies. And the Native American population was subdued in the most horrific ways, often. Certainly for the overall history of this country, it was one of the most brutal genocides ever carried out. Anyway, but read about it if you don't know that. I really, just going to pop culture, Little Big Man, just watch the 7th Cavalry charge a tribe that is sitting on land that was told to them they could sit on, and the warriors are gone, and it's women and children, and they're brutally slaughtered. That is not just Hollywood. It's an excellent reproduction of horrific events that absolutely are documented to have occurred at Wounded Knee and elsewhere, time and again. So that was the cavalry. I was brought up thinking that it was a good thing if you heard the cavalry coming. They were here to rescue you. Well, guess what? It was a terror if you heard the cavalry coming for many human beings, the human beings that occupied this land prior to the European arrival. So, experiential education. Now, this is where Lewin is helping people learn how to learn from experience. It's not automatic. You have experiences every day. It doesn't mean you learn from them. You have to have structure for reflecting on the experience and making sense out of it. And so experiential education creates that structure if it's effective. It's not just guaranteed. You have to have an effective structure, like a T group that is run by trainers who understand that the T stands for training, and so they're there to have you learn certain principles through the training activity and through the experiential ambiguity of the group process, where you're literally learning from what is happening in the moment. It takes some getting used to. But the power of it is unprecedented. And if it's run with structure, it can't just be run with ambiguity. And that is how the T group movement, a large percentage of people came to the belief that you just run it without structure. And that I think is crazy. And I know a lot of good learning comes from it. So again, I'm probably upsetting some people, but the original intent and design absolutely was training in basic skills, training in understanding group dynamics, and learning from the immediate experiences you're having in the group with structure. So then finally, action research. I think that's the final part of my Lewinian social science chapter. It is. And so you can conduct action research. I just met with my bank. It took a year and a half before they actually decided to let me come in and see how do they know that they are a fair lender. They initially just sent me back standard emails saying, we are a fair lender. And I said, well, that's nice, but given the history of banking in the United States, which is not a pretty history, there has been, all the way through the PPP loans, blacks have been denied access. The GIs that fought in World War II, the black GIs did not have access in the GI Bill to home ownership. They were blocked, even though they stormed Normandy. For heaven's sake, what kind of a country is this? If we want to be a democracy, then we've got to actually act like a democracy. And home ownership is one of the primary ways that people have access to improving their financial condition and to passing it on to the generations. And that has been one-sidedly denied blacks and women through most of our history. And so it's time to stop that. And so banks need to be very careful to monitor their own bankers, because the PPP loans, there was no risk to any bank, and yet lenders all over the country denied blacks in droves. And it turned out that the way for blacks to get loans, PPP loans, was only through the online programs that did it without knowing ethnicity. And that's just sad. But that's real, and that's now. Okay, that is now. That is, 3 years ago. That's now. And so prejudice in lending is a thing. It's not something that's historical. It's current, contemporary. And so finally, my bank sat down with me. This is action research. I said, well, what can I do? Well, I would like to know that the bank I bank with is doing something to assure that they have fair lending. And so they have to monitor they have to monitor their loans. My bank is called WSFS. And I'm happy to say it's a Delaware bank, the oldest bank, one of the oldest banks in the country, I think, but that they have in place now a way to monitor, to make sure that if the loans are handed out strictly based on your financial condition, that still leaves unfairness to it, because people that are light-skinned are likely to have better financial conditions in this country for many reasons. One being that their ancestors had access to home loans. But that's not the only reason. So, but monitoring now that you are lending fairly is a step in the right direction, and WSFS is doing that. So I appreciated that. But the other thing they're doing is going into communities that used to be redlined for no loans, and they are making their loans more accessible. So they're reaching out to minority communities. They are actually offering to pay up to $30,000 to just give it as a grant for people who are close to being able to buy a home but don't have the money for a down payment from minority communities. And I celebrate that, because we have not got an even playing field, and we have to do things to even it. So stop whining about it if you don't like it when people who have been underprivileged are given some help to get to an even place. They're far from an even place now. And it's not always going to be perfect. Sometimes it's going to mean that people that didn't need something get something. There's all kinds of corruption and graft in our society. Look at the PPP loans again. I think it was the Lakers that got a huge one as a struggling small business. So nothing's perfect, but we have to do things to make it better. Now that's action research by an individual. Action research can also be done. Well, Lewin did a lot of action research. He did things like when public housing was first coming in, he had 2 units. He worked closely with the U.S. government on many projects. 2 units had integrated housing, and 2 units were segregated. And he did before and after studies of the people in the units. And the people in the segregated units held on to their biases and also were more tense, especially in the white segregated unit. They didn't even get along with each other, comparatively. In the desegregated units, the mixed units, people started to overcome their past biases. They started to have a sense of community with their neighbors. And so you have to, with structure, bring people together if you want things to be different. He did some other wonderful things, like he had people in elevators. Somebody would make a bigoted statement, and then there would be various responses. And the overwhelming majority were very uncomfortable if there was no response. And they didn't respond either, obviously. They kept their mouth shut. The overwhelming majority greatly preferred if somebody said something polite but firm, like, "Boy, I'm really uncomfortable with what you just said." They challenged the person making the bigoted, sexist, racist, whatever it was statement, anti-Semitism, whatever the statement was. And finally, they still preferred if somebody got angry at the person, but that was more uncomfortable and less preferred than if people were just clear and firm. But everyone preferred that over silence. Silence is consent, or at least it can be perceived that way. And you start wondering if everyone else in the elevator agrees with the person who made the bigoted comment. So these are just examples of Lewin's action research. Another one, he had people in New York. The idea was that there could be black clerks in the department stores. And the department store owners were afraid that the white shoppers would stop shopping at their stores if they had black clerks. So Lewin did a survey of the white shoppers, and overwhelmingly they said they didn't care what race the clerks were. They were loyal to the stores. All they cared about was what the store was selling, more or less. And so the stores in New York City started allowing black clerks. So that is action research from Lewin. That's just a small sample of the work Lewin did to address racism in the United States. So read about it, read the book, but do your own action research. What are you trying to change in your community? Get people together that, including the people who seem to be against it, and have a dialogue and ask the institutions that you're in, what are they doing to make sure that historical racism and sexism doesn't continue in their institutions? Do that in your company. You can make change. And if there's an education component to it, make it an education component that's respectful of everybody in the room. We didn't create the racist structure of the United States. We're living in it. And we need all the help we can get from anybody who's willing to work towards change so that eventually we have a democracy that really represents everybody in this culture and is strong. Our democracy right now is fragile because of division and because authoritarianism has been strong in this country since the onset of the European colonies. So it's time for change, and Lewin's social science is a guide that is rational, that can help create structure for change. And so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have the foundation. So read my book. It's going to do you good. And read my Lewin book, Plan Change. But most importantly, get active. We can do better. And future generations deserve us to clean up the mess that we're in today. It's time. Okay. Lovely talking to you. I'd love to hear from you. Take care. Hey, I appreciate you listening. This, again, is Gil Crosby. And I want you to take advantage of what's available to you. I have many free materials. I am happy to talk to people about their situations, especially if you're trying to create change, either social change or organization change. We have frequent workshops that are available, T group workshops. If you have never been in a T group with us, then don't miss it in your life. Many people have said to me, of all the trainings I've ever received, I got this one 30 years ago, and it's the only one that stuck with me. You're learning from your actual interactions with the other participants and with the faculty. The faculty are walking the same talk that they're teaching of behavioral skills. It's a training workshop. That's what the T stands for. This is done in the spirit of the creation of T groups by Kurt Lewin and his associates. It's for groups. It's for teams. That's how it was originally designed. It is a opportunity to learn about theory and put it directly into practice. Again, the original design, you learn things and then you put them into practice. It was not just all ambiguity, which is how some T groups, most are led today, where the faculty hardly says anything. That's not how this is designed. So join us for that. There's always workshops. There's the Leadership Institute of Seattle, which has certificate programs, a two-year program where you will learn from T groups and learn how to do all the organization development work that my father designed, most of it, and I continue that practice alongside my brother Chris and many other associates. So Don't be a stranger. There's a lot going on. It's always changing. So be in touch, and it's on the website, crosbyod.com. I look forward to working with you in your organization or as you pursue things like reducing gun violence and decreasing racism in our society. Whatever your goals are, the social science of Kurt Lewin guides how to achieve those goals in a reliable way. And so that's what I apply and practice every day and invite you to.